Our first speaker is Noah Matson. Noah directs Defender's effort to create and implement policies and strategies to safeguard wildlife and habitat from the impacts of global warming. Working with a team of scientists, policy experts, attorneys, and communication specialists, Noah is developing climate change adaptation strategies for land and wildlife managers and is working to influence climate change adaptation policies in federal agencies. Noah was a project director for Defender's award-winning report, Refuges at Risk, The Threat of Global Warming, which highlighted the impacts of global warming on national wildlife refuges and recommendations to address the impacts. And please welcome Noah to the stage.
Welcome, everyone. Really happy to be here and happy to be invited to talk today. Even though my current job is focused almost solely on climate change policy, I have a long history of the refuge system. It's nice to see so many familiar faces. So we have an action-packed panel for you today. Oops, sorry about that. We have a panel of 3 acts. I'm going to be talking about vision, big picture stuff, national policy stuff. Then we're going to bring you down to Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge, and Mike Bryant's going to talk to us about what you can actually do on the ground to deal with this big issue of sea level rise. And finally, Hinds is going to give us a dose of reality. How do you actually implement your science-based, the best management plans in the world when you have to deal with your surrounding community? So, it was mentioned that I worked on a report on refuges and climate change a few years ago, and that was only in 2006. And way back then, we were talking about climate change in the future. We were looking at models and making some inferences of what types of impacts we might be seeing sometime in the future. Well, just a few years later, we're seeing climate change today. So this year in particular has been kind of crazy. We've had record-breaking floods. 6 states have set precipitation records just in April alone. Is anybody in one of those states? We've had, Texas has had the driest 6-month period on a record. Droughts throughout the Southeast. Anybody in Arizona? I don't need to tell you about the Wallow Fire or New Mexico, and fires throughout Texas. And tornadoes. April has a set record number of tornadoes this year. All that was just in April. So, like I said, climate change, we don't have to talk about what impacts might we see for climate change. We're seeing it already. And I'm not suggesting that any of these events are caused by climate change. But this is exactly the type of events that we can expect more of, and we should start planning for. So what's that mean for the refuge system? This is becoming somewhat of a cliched example because we have these great historic photos, but Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge on the eastern shore of Maryland is literally washing away. This series of photos from 1938 when it was established all the way up through 1989, I'm sure it's worse now, shows a progressing loss of marsh and a bigger increase of open water. Open water is dark gray there. And the arrow points to the same location on the photo. It says that location used to be marsh, is now completely surrounded by water. They lost a third of their marsh. Over 300 acres a year are currently being lost. Well, the refuge isn't just sitting around on their hands letting their marsh go. So there are a couple things that are going on with the marsh there. There's sea level rise, subsidence, and invasive nutria. The refuge has done an amazing job of eradicating nutria from the refuge and have kind of checked off that problem. And they embarked on a pretty amazing restoration effort using dredge material to kind of spray mud all over the open water to raise the level of the marsh, and had hundreds of volunteers go out and plant grasses there and stabilize the marsh. And this area was restored over 10 years ago and is still doing great. That was very successful, but it was also very expensive and very time-consuming. But that success led the refuge to think about a plan. Well, how do we get this to scale? There points to, if you can see it back there, there's a kind of a divot throughout the center of the Chesapeake Bay, and that's the Baltimore Harbor Approach Channel that's regularly dredged by the Army Corps. And the Army Corps needs to put material someplace. So Refuge, for the last few years, has been proposing to take that dredge material and restore the refuge. Unfortunately, it's at a cost of over $1 billion. So it's likely not to happen anytime soon. So as I visited Refuge, the Blackwater Refuge a number of years ago, a couple things started to occur to me about how refuges are and should be dealing with climate change. The first one was, should we be resisting this change? Does it matter if Blackwater actually goes underwater? No one seemed to be asking that question. So the first thing is, how do we look at our conservation targets at the scale of a refuge? We really have to do it at a broader landscape scale. So here's the broader Chesapeake all the way down to the Albemarle Sound, where Mike lives. And that's the kind of the scale of analysis you need to look at to figure out whether it matters whether Blackwater goes underwater. There might be other places that are more resilient to these changes. We might have new marshes someplace else. We might be able to restore closer to the dredge material. So that's the first thing that I started thinking about in the context of climate change. It's not about a particular plot of land, it's about your conservation target. And we need to be thinking about what are our conservation targets and how do they change, and change spatially and temporally. The other thing that occurred to me is that at the time, Blackwater was kind of doing their own thing. And Mike was down Alligator River doing his own thing. And it didn't seem to be a lot of communication or support for individual refuges to be making these really hard decisions about how do we manage in the context of this kind of change. It's not just these couple of refuges, but there's over 160 coastal refuges throughout the country. And again, virtually all of them are kind of making, I'm sure many of you are from them, are making decisions without the benefit of a network of sharing knowledge. And so there's a danger of people reinventing the wheel. Now, so it seems to me that it makes sense that we need to prioritize landscape scale and that no refuge is alone, and we need to provide managers with the tools and guidance they need to make these decisions. The reason I have all these different tires up is that even though I think that we need to provide managers with tools for dealing with these issues, they're going to have to be locally adapted. So we might not be totally reinventing the wheel, we might be tweaking the wheel as we go. So the good news is that there are up-and-coming institutions and mechanisms to start dealing with this. We have the National Fish, Wildlife, and Plants Climate Adaptation Strategy and the network of LCCs. Unfortunately, I don't think either of them is necessarily getting at these particular questions adequately yet, and that's an opportunity that we need to take advantage of. So what do we need to do moving forward? First, I think this is a Refuge Visioning Conference. We need to think about how do we manage the refuge system and wildlife in general in an era of constant change. You know, a couple of years ago, when Defenders started looking into adaptation and how we're going to get through this, we call it getting through the bottleneck, that we just had to help species get through some short-term period while the world figures out how to cut emissions and save the planet. I think the science tells us now that with all the emissions we've thrown up there and the trajectory we were going, we're going to be changing for millennia. So now the area of stationarity is dead. That has profound impacts on our wildlife and habitat and the whole profession of conservation. And we really haven't gotten our arms around that yet. Not only is that affecting wildlife and habitat, but it's affecting people. And if you own a beachfront property or have a beachfront community, you're going to want to protect it. So we're going to see a lot of calls for beach armoring like this picture, or beach nourishment. And again, we shouldn't let our refuge managers out there alone to address these issues one by one by one. We need some guidance and support nationally for that. So I guess my final message is that we need to prepare for change. And I look forward to the rest of the presentations.
Good afternoon. I'm Mike Bryant, and I'm the project leader for a complex of 6 refuges in eastern North Carolina and the Red Wolf Recovery Program. And about 7 years ago, starting a conversation with a scientist with the Nature Conservancy, we arrived at the conclusion based on just the observations of our biologists that have been around for 30 years, looking and working in this landscape, and that scientist, that profound change was occurring in this lower coastal plain of North Carolina, and we could attribute it in part to sea level rise. What its cause isn't my concern. It is in fact happening, and that was our concern. And so the question was, do we just become chroniclers? Do we just do a chronicle of the change and do nothing, or do we actually try and do something and adapt to that change? And it evolved into a project that the Nature Conservancy, who was interested in Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge, one of the 6 that I manage, and that they could help do something on that refuge if I was interested in them helping. They went out with a simple proposal that I had agreed to and sought money and got money from Duke Energy Company, $1 million. And then they acquired another $500,000 from other sources to do work on the refuge in the form of adaptation. And the whole notion of doing this is to see not if we can stop the change, but to affect the rate of change and in the near term deal with that profound change we've been seeing, and then also develop plans that allow us to look into the distant future and find out what we could do for wildlife in this landscape. This landscape has a significant amount of investment from the conservation community. It's a very vulnerable landscape. We have extremely low elevations. It's the 3rd most vulnerable region in North America. The relative sea level rise has been 3 to 3.3 millimeters per year. It's an area where it's struck for 6 months out of the year by tropical storms and hurricanes, which can change the landscape overnight. And through the winter, long duration nor'easters coming off the Atlantic that also can cause profound change, an enormous amount of erosion along a coastal shoreline. In this landscape, you see in the large map, the colored areas that show you how low the landscape is, the darker purples being the lowest. Where's the little, oh, here you go. The pointer, I've got the pointer at the bottom of the map. If I move it up onto the map, this purple area right here is Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge and a bombing range. That's a 200,000 acre peninsula, 152,000 acres of which is the refuge, and 46,000 acres is a rectangular hole in the middle of that refuge. It's all habitat except for about 4,000 acres that's used as an inert bombing area. That area is quite low in the landscape and susceptible to sea level rise, susceptible to storm across the fetch of those estuary bodies. And because the land was owned prior to the refuge by timber interest and other interests, it's heavily ditched. And that ditching has caused significant draining in areas. And there are regional impacts as a consequence of the changes that have been occurring here, from shoreline erosion to saltwater inundation and a variety of other changes we've all noticed, invasive species coming in, rapid change of plant communities from forest to marsh, and large catastrophic wildfires. We just had a 46,000-acre wildfire at Alligator River. I've been the manager there for 15 years. It's our first large fire. The refuge just west of this one, Pocosin Lakes, which is 110,000 acres, just to the west of it, it had a 46,000-acre wildfire in 2008. The frequency of wildfire here is usually on more like a 20-year, 25-year time frame. We're getting larger fires here now on this shorter than 10-year time frame. Yes?
What do you mean by relative sea level rise?
It's relative to two effects. One, the sea is rising, and two, the land is subsiding. So if the land is either subsiding or accreting and the sea is rising, you come to a mark. So the question is, in this vulnerable area, why adapt? You know, climate change causes long-term and potentially catastrophic stressors on this area, and it is vulnerable to significant change in the near term. And that's what we've been observing in just the span of a career of biologists. In this area, there's a huge investment in conservation. There's over 500,000 acres of land in conservation between refuges and state lands and private conservation holdings. This particular region, but for the coastal development, is very rural, and it depends on both the coast and internally. It depends on tourism, and it depends on commercial and recreational fishing and hunting and some of the other traditional rural land uses. And the indirect issues that we're dealing with that we would get benefit from if we adapt this landscape properly is dealing with things like storm surge and improving and maintaining water quality in the area. For us, we want resilience in this landscape. As the Nature Conservancy scientists put it, if you get change that's so rapid that you lose the entire plant community and all you have is exposed soil and it erodes quickly, you just wind up with this big colloidal ooze sitting there, not very productive, not much biological activity, obviously not much biodiversity of any sort. We can expect change over time, but if we can adapt this landscape, while we may see a difference in the assemblage of wildlife and plants there, we still may be able to, through adapting, have abundant wildlife and plenty of biodiversity over a long period of time. What developed was a partnership, and the partnership was pretty simple. It was us, the Fish and Wildlife Service, me standing there with the Nature Conservancy saying, hey, I'm land rich but dollar poor, and if you have an idea and you can do some work on this land, I'm willing, because it makes sense, the kind of work we were talking about. It's a large landscape. The area outlined in green has 9 national wildlife refuges in it, so the Fish and Wildlife Service has a huge investment here. Since the 30s, there have been refuges being established here. Just a little outside that green area, there's a couple more refuges coming into out of Virginia, and one is in Virginia. So there's 11 refuges in this little geographic area. And so starting in 2009, when the Nature Conservancy was able to find the donor, an energy company who's interested in trying to see how they could help in this venture, we started a project. And starting in this year, we signed an MOU with the Nature Conservancy to expand it to all 9 refuges in the coastal plain of North Carolina. The regional climate-related impacts that we've been seeing over time are these 6. We're seeing our shorelines erode on our refuges. We're seeing inundation of land, habitat transition from forest to marsh, and then land gone. Phragmites and alligator weed, which are both invasives for this area, getting into areas where we haven't disturbed the soil, it's just showing up in the waterways and on the land. Salt water from these estuaries is intruding through the man-made ditch system deep into it. These very flat, low-lying areas are sheet flow-driven systems where if it rains, the water gets on the land and works across. If there's storm surge, it has to get up on the shoreline on the front line and move across the land. But with the ditch system, it comes in deep, and on a heavy rain, it jets out of these ditch systems. And that has, both directions, has negative effects on either the waters adjacent or on the land within the refuge itself. And then we have been having more frequent large catastrophic fires. The strategies that we are starting to employ and are putting in place now are to deal with these stressors of wave energy and storm surge along our shorelines, to manage the habitat transition, some hydrologic restoration, which enables us to get this back to a sheet flow system and also keep the land wetter than it has been in recent past. And our initial on-the-ground focus is in this red box area on Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge. It's one road going east to west out to the Pamlico Sound, and along this road we have a transition from the Estuarine Sound system into the interior of the refuge where we could do experimental work that's on the ground with monitoring to see if these adaptations are effective and do the science to prove it. The monitoring program includes getting data like water quality and water flows, water table levels, measuring erosion rates, accretion and subsidence on the soils. The vegetative communities, we're looking at survival rates of plantings we're doing, and doing the monitoring and inventory work pre and post application of these adaptations on fish and oyster densities. What we've done on the land first is to plant experimental plots of trees. We have a forested community called the Pocosin. It's a evergreen shrub bog community with organic soils or peat soils. And these are transitioning to marsh. We want to find out which tree species are most tolerant in this environment to persist so that we can learn if we and others want forest, which species are going to persist longest. So if we plant, we'll have a forest there for a long time. So we've done these plots, planted them in March of 2010, and the results are promising so far for the species we expected. Bald cypress of species that were taken from seeds in this geographic area and grown in nursery and planted here. Great survival rate on bald cypress and black gum. Good survival on the pond pine, which is the predominant pine species there, with some mortality. And we'll continue to monitor growth and survivorship of these trees to see over time which persist longest in this changing environment. Our hydrologic manipulation in this area was to take the canal beside the road that goes east-west and to install this three-pipe flashboard riser structure. The most interesting difference on this is on the outlet side are those valves. Rather than having an old flap gate, these are a heavy rubber valve that curls back on itself and cuts off the water completely. And salt water is denser than fresh water. And when the water comes in off the sound, it's coming in as a saltwater wedge on the bottom of the canal. An old flap gate flutters and doesn't shut very quickly, and the salt water continues to intrude on up the canal system and then can push out onto the land and start to affect the soil productivity, break the soil down. The organic soil will start to break down into something that looks like coffee grounds and increase the rate of erosion on those soils. You get the combination of killing plants and the soil breaks down as well, and then away the soil goes. But that structure there has shown promise, so we installed it. At the bottom picture on the right is a sheet pile ditch plug. And there's a ditch on the other side of this road, which is shallow, that was dug in for other purposes before we ever owned the refuge. And rather than bringing in dirt to plug these, we're going to install sheet pile plugs like this because of trafficability. And that will force the water to start to get across the land rather than drain into ditches and go out or come jetting in. And we're seeing promising results from this. There are oyster reefs that have been built just off our shoreline, and the salinities with the water coming off the land through the canal system were highly variable, going from about 1.5, 2 parts per thousand on up to nearly 20. Now, with the ditch under control from water running off of it, the fresh water coming off the land, and it's a tannin-stained black water that's coming off, and it's hypoxic. It doesn't have much oxygen in it. We're seeing fewer spikes in the salinities around these oyster reefs, which aren't far from that ditch outlet, which is encouraging to us. And upstream in the canal, before it was installed, we're seeing the salinities all over the map. Right there on that red line was from the date of installation, and we're already getting through the monitoring that the salinities upstream of that structure are not spiking like they did before, which is doing just what we hoped it would do. We're also working with the Nature Conservancy to see if we can do anything or should do anything with invasive species. As a refuge manager, I want to get rid of Phragmites, but Phragmites may be holding on to the land. So we have to start thinking in terms of the benefits, which I never thought I'd say, of Phragmites, and versus, the downside. This area with the yellow patches on it was where the frag was mapped, north of that road and canal. And you see it along a pretty regular rectangular area, and that's because prior to this being a refuge in 1984, the state put in a waterfowl impoundment on this land that was owned by a timber company. It projected out into those sound waters another couple hundred yards. It's eroded back that far to where you see today, but Phragmites has started appearing in there. So the Nature Conservancy applied herbicide on it and have evaluated both the cost effectiveness of it, because everything they're doing, they're evaluating cost effectiveness, the actual effectiveness of the treatment, whether it's a water control structure or frag control, and then we're having dialogue about the benefit of control of this species or maybe leaving it in places. The nearshore oyster reef was another component, and that was for attenuating the wave energy against our shoreline. Now, this is off the refuge. It's in state waters, but it's adjacent to it. And these oyster reefs that you can see at the bottom, in the bottom pictures, are built parallel to our shoreline, about 50 yards off the shore, with gaps in it. The gaps had to be put in based on state requirements. And we have seen, and they're using two different kinds of materials, limestone marl and oyster bags. These are just a mesh bag full of oyster shells. Intense labor to do it, but they've gotten probably 10,000 hours of volunteer help to bag them, so you had that citizen involvement, plus some of the energy companies sent a whole bunch of people to help do that as well. But they want to try different materials to see which materials work best. They want to also see how they can involve citizens where they can. So that's all part of what this experimental oyster reef work is about. It's combining a number of things to find out what works best, what benefits the project best, what turns into, from a biological standpoint, the very best structure. And what they're seeing is early strike of the oyster spat on the reef and increased numbers of fish around it. No surprise there. Structure, you get structure in a place and you get fish. And of course, on our shoreline, we're seeing some decreases in erosion. Now, if you look at the top and the bottom, you have to remember the wave environment was different when they were doing these measurements. and during pre- and post-construction. The wave environment pre-construction, when they were doing monitoring, was pretty low, so you didn't see heavy erosion in those areas along the controls 1, 2, and 3. But along the oyster reefs 1, 2, and 3, where they were going to go in, there was heavy erosion. You see the erosion rates drop off in spite of a higher wave energy environment on the post-construction. So it's telling you that the oyster reef is actually attenuating wave energy and slowing the rate of erosion in our shoreline. Now, the density of the oyster spat has increased over time, just as we expected, and they've got measurements of where they're striking on these reefs, both at the crest and the slope and the base, to understand what's happening biologically on these reefs. The next step after this pilot project, which has occurred over the past 2 years, is to expand onto the refuge and other locations. The green arrows are more ditches. We've got to go find every small forested ditch, whether there's a road beside it or not, and get in those sheet pile plugs so that we can drive this system back to being a sheet flow system, where water has to move across the land off the sound system, or if it rains, it's got to get back on the land and not down a ditch out to the sound system. And that will be a continuation of this project on this refuge, but the project is going to go larger than this because we've signed the MOU with the Nature Conservancy to work on 9 refuges in eastern North Carolina. And the lessons to date that we've learned is, the barriers obviously to implementation are funding. I didn't have a dime. I've contributed $10,000 and labor, installing water control structures, providing areas for them to stockpile materials like oyster shells. Those are the kinds of things we've done as a refuge and done the environmental compliance work to allow, get the permits to do these things. The other barriers are, if you don't have some existing infrastructure, it becomes a big challenge to get this kind of infrastructure in place. And there is a lack of public knowledge, and there has been some vandalism of some of the monitoring devices that are out there. And our law enforcement keeps track of these sites a little better now as a consequence. So we're learning as we go. The monitoring data indicates so far initial success on what we expected the result to be and hoped it to be. Some of these we know are very labor intensive and may be difficult to scale up to, but we're trying to experiment in a variety of ways to see what kind of adaptation works best. The conservation community really loves this project. One, because there's a lot of talk about climate change from a scientific perspective, and there's a lot of talk about planning strategies. There's very few opportunities to find a place where somebody's implementing something on the ground to affect the rate of change. And that's what this project is about. And the things that we are trying to uphold are good science, so that we have an adaptive management plan, there's good monitoring, we have an operational committee, and that's just myself, my biologist, the Nature Conservancy's project manager they hired with the money they got, and then a scientific advisory panel from a number of universities that helps provide input and guidance into making sure we're monitoring in a way that is scientifically valid. And then we have other interested groups in media. We've done a lot of work with local and national media on this project, and we're hoping to get some peer-reviewed work out of it. The partners are growing in number and diversity every month. It's really the Nature Conservancy pursuing the partnerships and me encouraging it. But we're their primary partner because they're doing this work on the refuge at this point. But they've gotten grants from NOAA and EPA. They're communicating with the Corps and these other entities. And you can see the state entities, the number of universities involved, and the number of nonprofits involved. They're all interested. Some are making contribution in dollars. Some are making contribution in technical advice. And they're all welcome to contribute in any way they choose to the project, but they all have keen interest in it. The application of this coastal adaptation work on both federal lands and state lands is, I think, has great promise. In this area, we expect on Alligator River Refuge, based on the predictions over the next 150 years, to lose 80% of that land to just inundation. So whatever we do is buying time. It's not sealing the deal and having habitat forever. The second set piece is, what do you do over the long run? And in this same geographic area, we've formed a land protection group of all the entities that own land that is in conservation. And we've been meeting now for over a year, and we're identifying, we, the Fish and Wildlife Service, are facilitating it by providing maps of all the conservation lands and then having dialogue on where are the next best places for wildlife up gradient from these lands that ultimately will become inundated and go to being aquatic systems. And we're identifying that set piece as the long-term solution so that we can have a plan in place that deals with maximizing the benefits to wildlife for the lands we have today and having them go through an orderly transition over time, while also looking way into the future to acquire, it doesn't matter to me if it's a refuge or if it's an easement. It doesn't matter. Is there going to be land for wildlife? This landscape has some of the highest densities of black bear in North America, and certainly on the East Coast. We have, as the Fish and Wildlife Service, reintroduced the endangered red wolf here. So we have a serious interest in that species surviving and becoming recovered. And these habitat types, which are all sitting on a unique soil type, peatlands, and some of the peat soils are quite deep, are unique in the world and unique in this part of the United States, and they produce unique plant communities. And so the plant communities are unique. You can have natural heritage areas that are identified and registered by the state and recognized by at the national and international level. You've got bottomland hardwood systems here that are vast and important up that long finger to the northwest, where the Roanoke River Refuge is. So there's an assemblage of plants and plant communities and wildlife here that we want to preserve, but the only way to do it out to 150 and 200 years is to acquire more land interest for wildlife in this landscape while we manage and adapt to this change which is occurring today. Thank you.
Sorry, Mike, for missing your introduction earlier. They didn't give the moderators any bathroom breaks. But our next speaker is Lou Hinds. Lou is a native of New Jersey. Lou's first contact with the Fish and Wildlife Service came when the government bought his grandfather's land to make it part of the Great Swamp National Wildlife Refuge. With the old homestead now gone, Lou made a decision that would last a lifetime. In 1967, he decided to take a summer job with the service. This part-time high school employment opportunity turned into a full-time career. Lou graduated from Rutgers University College with a BS in wildlife biology. He has now worked for the Fish and Wildlife Service for 39 years. It doesn't say this in your bio, but I think you're currently the refuge manager for Chincoteague National Wildlife Refuge. So, please welcome Lou.
Thank you. You're probably wondering why I'm standing down here, and that's because I fought to have note takers here to capture your thoughts. And instead of having a note taker, they gave us a videographer, and I'm going to make his job difficult. I'm going to move around. I'm going to give him a moving target, so he's got to follow me. Well, thank you. And my part of this, we've heard policy. Thank you very much. We've heard policy, and I'm hoping that you're going to give us a lot of feedback on what you think is what we need for policy. What kind of direction do we need from the Department of the Interior? I'm not putting questions in your mind, but I'm hoping I'm going to hear some of those. And then Mike gave us a really outstanding presentation on adapting a refuge today and looking into the future and what we're going to do. My point, and I got to tell you, I've got the easy part here because there's no one way to do this, but how do you engage your communities? This is a big deal for us. And so that's my part of this presentation is our refuges, our neighbors, and how do we engage them in the discussion of sea level rise. Now, Mike, are you in a room here, Mike, somewhere? Everybody turn around and take a look at Mike. And Mike, keep the hand up there, all right? You need to go talk to Mike at some point after this presentation because as you'll see on here, right down here, this was a June 28th, 2011, so this is very current cartoon. It says, "Welcome to Prime Hook." Now here's Mike's problem. He's got a community out there basically almost into the ocean, and they've got a road that comes through the refuge. And it says, "With this road 18 inches lower than normal spring tides and a rising sea level, my research is empirical." You mean a long-term solution requires a miracle? Yeah, you know, and that's what Mike is facing, all right? And I got to tell you that there's a lot of us that are facing that issue. Here are all the coastal national wildlife refuges, and including those in Hawaii and Alaska, Navassa, and Puerto Rico and the Caribbean islands. And I did a little math last night. Oh, let's see if I can get this thing to move forward. There we go. We have 167 coastal refuges, all right? These refuges range from the Arctic Circle to the remote coral reefs and tropical lagoons and the equator. This is the thing. These refuges include 20 million coastal acres and 30,000 coastal miles. Do you think in those 30,000 coastal miles we have a few communities that we may have to engage with? Yeah, we do. And how we do it is going to be different for each community. And catch this, from the Arctic to the Caribbean, from the Maine out to the Marianas Trench, we're going to engage a bunch of different cultures. We need to know how to engage those cultures. Now, I'm not going to stand up here and tell you that I'm an expert. I'm not. Guy raised in New Jersey, out of Rutgers University, been up and down the East Coast, but I haven't been west. I've not engaged with cultures up in Alaska or down in the Caribbean or out in the atolls. But I got to tell you, these are the faces, this is the face of the community that we're going to be engaged with. Now, so who are our refuge neighbors and what are their beliefs? Well, I'm going to talk a little bit that in a second, but I want you to understand that I'm not an expert in this research either. So what I'm going to talk about is I'm going to give you my spin on it, but these are the people. They range from alarmed through concerned to cautious to disengaged. The disengaged folks around our refuges. Oh, man. The doubtful and the outright dismissive. All right? These are the people. Now, as we get into this, I want you to write down this, if you would for me, this website, because this website is for the Global Warming 6 Americas. How many of you have heard about this study? Now, we got a few people out there. So this is a good study, but it deals with climate change. All right? It doesn't talk about just singularly sea level rise. It talks about climate change. And climate change has a lot of political baggage that goes along with it. Political baggage that goes along with it. And as Mike said, he doesn't care why sea level is rising. Neither do I. I don't care. It's happening. It's been happening, quite frankly, for the last 10,000 years. But we're just paying attention to it now. So the authors of this research, and I'm going to kill their names, but I'm going to go with Anthony Lee Sarowich, Edward Maybach, Connie Rosa Renoff, one I can pronounce, Nicholas Smith. These are the researchers, and they did their research. They're working out of Yale on a project on climate change and George Mason University Center for Climate Change Communication. Now, the most recent interview dates that they just did was April 23rd through May 12th, 2011. So I'm going to show you some of that research. There were 981 adults that participated in that study. Now, here you go. Let's use 2008 as the base year, all right? Here's the base year. Now, here are your people, the alarmed. In 2008, there was 18% of the American public was alarmed. What does alarm mean? Hey, they're willing to take action. They're concerned. They think climate change is going to hammer them. And they're very concerned. They're willing to talk to their political leaders, and they're willing to come to your meeting. They want to hear what you have to say. And they're going to do something about it if they can, because they're concerned or alarmed. Then we get the concern. Now, this is more representative, maybe, of America. 33%, we're concerned. We're hearing what the scientists are saying, but, we're really not totally 100% on board, but we're hearing it, all right? Then we got the cautious. There was 19% of those folks. And again, it's going to take some convincing to get them to really engage with their political leaders and to get on the bandwagon and come out to the refuge and support what you're doing. Then there was a disengaged. And luckily, it's only 12%, but these are the people at our refuges that no matter what you say or what you do, unless you make it personal, unless you make your meeting personal to them, they're not coming out. And I'm going to give you an example of how to make it personal. Doubtful, I don't think this is, nah. You're going to really have to find some empirical evidence to convince me that there's anything going on with climate change. And lastly, the dismissive folks, nothing you will say. And if these people turn up, let me tell you from personal experience, if they turn up at one of your meetings and they're feeling good and they're full of fire, beware. They're the ones that are going to hammer you. And these people here, unless you have the data, unless you have your talking points, we need to talk a little bit about talking points. Unless you know what your talking points are and you stay on them talking points, that little 7% can sway this group right in here. All right? So just a little talk on it. Now notice what's happened over the years. 2010, all right, we had a reduction in the alarmed. We had a reduction in, a little bit, reduction in the concerned. It went up though. We have 27% that are cautious. So some of these folks moved over into this camp. Down for the disengaged. That's a good thing. That's actually a very good thing. More people were becoming engaged. But where did they go? Some of them might have slipped over into the doubtful role here. It actually went up. Look at this number, the dismissive. That drives me nuts. We're not out there talking about it. We got to get out there, folks, at our refuges. We got to get out in the communities. How many people at their visitor centers or how many stations I don't really want to know. But think about this. Are your visitor services staff, are they developing programs or contacts or whatever you want to call it that talks about this within the people just wandering into your refuge? Are you engaging them about this information? We've started doing that. We've had to do it at Chincoteague, but you really need to start thinking about that. Then lastly, this yellow 2011, this is the most current data. The alarmed has, again, has gone up to 12%. That may have been this last year's weather, tornadoes, fires. That may have, people are getting concerned again. What those scientists are saying may be right, all right? Then we got the 27% concerned. That's down another percentage point. I would consider this irrelevant, and so do the authors. They don't think that 1 percentage point is that big a deal. 25, cautious. Here, 10%, so we've gone from the disengaged, we've gone back to 10%. Here, 15% of doubtful. That's very troubling to me. And this one here is very troubling to me. We have 25% of Americans that are doubtful or dismissive about climate change. All right, so this is not good for us. And this is the face of the public that will be meeting with you at your meetings. All right, you need to go into that. Now, this is climate change. Sea level rise might be different, but you're still going to have this same grouping of folks there. I will tell you that when I got to Chincoteague, and I knew that this was going to be an issue for me, sea level rise, I asked my biologist, go find out. What's it being in, give me a number. How high has sea level rise come up? And from the end of the 1930s, say 35, 38, through the year 2000, we had a 1-foot sea level rise at Sandy Hook State Park in New Jersey, and it was a little over 16 inches at the Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel. We lie between there, so somewhere from a foot to a foot and a half, all right? I went to a community meeting, was talking to the community, just laying out what facts I had learned. You would be surprised, maybe you won, how many people just argued with me. That has not happened, Lou. If anything, it's just reverse. Land's coming up. There's nothing happening. And I'm going, ugh. But anyway, let's move on. Everything is local. Politics is local, all right? Your discussion with your cultures and with your community is local. Now, at Chincoteague, there are things that people are very proud of. This is a t-shirt shop and a towel shop. You can, they're proud of their lighthouse. They're proud of their Chincoteague ponies. As you can see by the mural, they're very proud of the ambience of the island. They love Assateague Island. They call themselves Teagers. The reason is most of Chincoteague, the refuge, lies on Assateague Island. And their heritage, their lineage of the family goes back to Assateague Island. Teague, they moved, most of the family members moved over to Chincoteague Island in the 1920s. Chincoteague, Teagers, the analogy. They consider themselves Teagers with their lineage going back to Assateague Island. Here's another picture of, this is the Village Inn. If you ever visit, great place to eat. But notice the lighthouse, the ponies, the beach scene, all right? They're very proud of that. But they also know that this is what draws the public. This is my beach right now. All right, this is my beach right now. July 4th weekend to September, Labor Day. This is what I got. This is one picture looking north up the beach. If the lifeguards, and I call them my lifeguards, but they're actually Park Service lifeguards, if the lifeguard who took this picture had turned around and taken a picture, been the same picture looking south. All right? So this is Chincoteague. I get 1.4 million visits per year. The economic driver for the community is this beach. All right? 3 months out of the year, they make almost all of their money for the entire year. Now, I'm going to show you this picture. This is the recreation. Come on. This is the recreational beach today. All right? Today. Oh, come on, Lou. Get it right. That's what the recreational beach looked like after the Tuesday, November 17th northeaster that came through and completely wiped out all of the parking on the beach. And not only wiped it all out, it moved the entire beach back and rolled it over and by about 20 yards or more, maybe 30. But it destroyed all the parking lots. Every time the Park Service went back to put the parking lots back, they were wiped out again. That continued through that entire winter season all the way up until March, and the Park Service was not able to get out there and restore the parking lots. Bottom line, it's costing a lot of money. I think it was between $400,000 and $500,000 to put the parking lots back into this condition. These are the restored parking lots right through here right now. We can put about 1,000 cars of parking in there, and that's what the community is holding my feet to the fire for right now. It's 1,000 cars of parking. Actually, if you were to look at the CCP, it would say 961 cars of parking. Don't ask me how they came up with 900. Well, Denny knows how. Denny knows, but we don't want to hear it, Denny, not now. That'll be a beer. That'll be over a good beer, how we came up with 961. If you're wondering what all these people are doing down here, this picture actually goes down quite a ways, but this is the Monday morning pony walk up the beach. They're moving the North Corral herd. They do it first thing in the morning, sunrise. They move the horses down the beach, and this is turning into one of the biggest refuge events that we have, unfortunately, but fortunately too. One of the biggest refuge events we have that attracts thousands of people. And they line up here waiting for the horses to come up the surf line, turn here, go down here, and then go down the road to the corral, which is over here. This is Pony Week. If you ever want to experience Pony Week, it's only 2 weeks away. Come on, enjoy them. The island normal population right now during the winter month is about 4,000, 4,500 people. It swells during this time through August, 25,000 people on Chincoteague Island. And they're all coming to the refuge. All right? So let's move on. Okay. So what can we do to respond to sea level rise? I think, Mike, this is the tack you're taking, right? You know, no. Another one of those things. I will tell you that the community wants to do exactly this. They want to fight sea level rise. They want us to renourish the beach. They want us to put in jetties. They want us to do what is ever humanly possible at any expense to keep that beach there. I ain't doing it. And I've told them that. But I've done it in a little bit nicer way than what I just did with you. All right? But you have to have your talking points. You have to know where you're going to go. And I'll be honest with you, and I'll say it on the camera. I think this is where personally, I think my agency has let me down. We don't have good, clear guidance on when we'll allow jetties or won't allow jetties. We don't have good, clear guidance when we're going to allow beach renourishment and when we're not. Now, I've said openly, I'll do anything I can. I'm a land manager. I'll do whatever I need to do for wildlife and to create wildlife habitat. But as far as a parking lot, I'm not there yet, all right? So it's one of those things that just bothers me a little bit, but we're going to try not to do this. Now, these are the old beach lines from 1882 through 2005. What you see down here is the current boundary of the refuge or of the border of the, and there's the Tom Coves Visitor Center, and this is where the current recreational beach is. Next picture, please, Lou. There. Here's me trying to get that connection for the public. When you go out to your audience, know your audience, give them something they can relate to. They can relate to a lost parking lot and the fact that it's been washed away. Well, what do they want? They want you to put it back. Remember, sea level rise isn't happening. This was a storm that took it out. Put it back, Lou. All right? What you see here is a survey marker, survey cap, that I discovered after that storm. Took a picture of the top of that cap, went back in, had one of my biologists work with USGS or whoever it was that manages these things, and I said, find out what you can about that survey cap. Kind of cool. Yes? Cold, wet, miserable. All of the above. Anyway. So we took that survey cap and we got the information from it, And turns out that when they put a man-made dune line in 1962, they sunk this survey cap in there to mark it. The person who stuck it in, God bless him, he decided, you know what, I'm going to take a walk to the beach and just pace it off. He didn't pull a tape. I'm going to pace it off. How far is it from this cap out to the surf line? It was 115 paces. All right, so from 62, when the refuge opened up for visitation, and that's something I didn't tell you, the first cars traveled out to Assateague Island in 1962. All right, that's when the bridge connecting Chincoteague with Assateague. Same year that survey marker was put in. At that location, and understand erosion rates are different up and down the shoreline, but at that location, there was 115 paces, or let's just say 100 yards, a football field of sand and dunes out in front of it, and it's all gone. This makes it real for the community. I encourage you to look for those things now on your refuges. You have to find that connection that you can show people that things have changed in your lifetime. Slow, but they have changed. Another thing that I did, and I'm almost running out of time here, well, I want to leave lots of time for discussion here. Sea level affecting marsh modeling. When I got there, I knew I needed something to take out to the community. And I was told, go talk to Bryant in the Washington office. They're doing something new called SLAM analysis, sea level affecting marsh modeling. How many have heard of those? Excellent. Oh, God, I can't tell you how happy I was. So I hired Delisa Padilla to do an advanced SLAM analysis. SLAM, sea levels affecting marsh modeling, gets slammed a lot by people because they don't feel that it's a real good model. So I asked Delisa, pick it up a bit, take it up a notch, fill in some of those gaps there that people are hitting on us about. So there's less argument. Now, I'm a great fan for models, and I'm going to talk about that later when we get into discussions. But anyway, SLAM is let me go back. So what I did is not only did I want something to take to the public, but I wanted to be able, for the public, outside of a meeting that they were having with me, to actually sit down at their own computer at home and look at the data, run the models, different scenarios. Let them come up with their own questions. So working with a company, we came up with this SLAM View. It's a web-based based application that provides tools for improved understanding of analysis of sea level affecting marsh models. Version 2.0, which is just hot off the press and is out there, was designed with user-friendliness in mind to assess impacts of sea level rise on coastal areas with both visualization and analysis, provides simultaneous comparisons, and to date, SLAM View provides access to SLAM simulations results for an entire coastlines of 5 states and partial coverage for an additional 4 states. There's the SLAM View site to go to. I highly recommend you go there, and if your refuges aren't on there, get them on there. Now, I will tell you, we are the only agency, and we're getting a lot of pats on the back. We're the only agencies putting this kind of stuff out there for our communities to look at. All right, and if you've had a SLAM model done, highly recommend that you talk with Leo Miranda at the Annapolis field office and the contractor that's working with us, Image Matters, and get your data up on there so that your community can look at it. So I want you to visualize this. This is the South Corral for the Chincoteague ponies. Beautiful scene. And actually, it's through a gate located over here that the ponies make a nice walk across the marsh out to a point out here where they're going to make that grand swim to Chincoteague Island at the end of July, to the delight of thousands of people. That area is right here. This is Horse Marsh. The refuge boundary is in black. That picture was taken from right about right there, looking to the south and west. All right, this is initial condition. I picked 1 meter for my SLAM analysis, not because the Department of the Interior jumped in and said, yeah, Lou, we want you to use 1 meter. It was based on what the state of Virginia was doing. State of Virginia told its agencies, plan on either somewhere between a 3-foot to a 5-foot sea level rise over the next 100 years. We picked 1 meter. So anyway, here's that marsh that we were just looking at. Here's where the ponies swim across. I want to quickly draw your attention to some things. Here's the road that brings you from the mainland over to Chincoteague Island, brings you out to down the Danny, what's the name of that road? Beach Road, and then and it comes out, and here is where the recreational beach is. Watch this area, watch these areas, watch this area, and what happens to the beach. This is initial conditions right now. This is what it looks like. This is 2050. Notice that the majority of your marshlands that were out here protecting the roadway have been converted, are either open water or are tidal flats. That the area that was marsh in between Chincoteague Island and Piney Island, a little subdivision or a little sub area, is now starting to get open water. Notice the pasture for the ponies, mostly mud flats, and the beach has again migrated back. Lastly, that's the model prediction for the year 2100. All open water around the roadway coming in. All my refuge lands to the north of Chincoteague Island are now underwater. Marsh Island is all gone. My impoundments no longer work. Most of my marshlands here are all gone. The island is rolled over on itself, and I did this, I'll be honest with you, I did this from Ocean City all the way down to Fisherman's Island, about 60, 70, 80 miles. And in several areas on Assateague Island, the Assateague has breaches in it and opens up again. So these are the kind of things that when you go to a community and you want to initiate dialogue, this is what you do. I chose to use Horse Marsh and that, but let me tell you, all those property owners, they weren't looking at Horse Marsh, they were looking at their property over here on Chincoteague Island. And this is what makes it personal to them. Now, the mayor is not a happy man with me, all right? And not because he doesn't believe it, but he doesn't believe it's going to happen at the rate that we're predicting here. But he did say one profound thing to me. Last year, the town celebrated its 100th anniversary as a community. When I talked to the mayor about joining me and working together on sea level rise, Louis says, if you go with 1 meter, I won't have a town for the next 100th anniversary or our 200th anniversary. And he's probably right. So these are the things when you're engaging your communities. And we're gonna, and so it's gonna be personal for them. And in the last presentations we heard about building bridges and going out there and opening up dialogue and being friendly with people. You gotta do that stuff. But know your talking points. I'm 100% sure of one thing. I'm not sure if this is gonna happen. I'm 100% sure that there's gonna be some change. I don't know if it's gonna be 1 foot. I don't know if it's gonna be 1 meter. I don't know if it's gonna be 1.5 meters, 2 meters. I don't know any of that. One thing I'm sure of, this model is wrong, but as we move forward and our data collection gets better, these models will get refined, and by the time that the next refuge manager has to do a CCP, that person will have better data. The models, I'm hoping, will be much better to predict the future of sea level rises on our refuges. Okay, one more link. If you have time to jot this link down, please do. It's video.pbs.org /video/2024047890. This is a video of sea level rise in action in Norfolk, Virginia right now. It is the area being impacted the worst by sea level rise, and are going to take you to one community that is experiencing it. I told you that we have 30,000 acres of coastline that we manage. I will guarantee you that every one of you in this room will have to engage your community in some sort of discussion about sea level rise, if you haven't already done it. That's me. That's my contact information. Be happy to talk to any of you about this subject anytime in the future, what we're doing, why we're doing it, how we're doing it. And in the end, we can talk about, energy independence, preserving the rainforest. Think about all those bullet points you could put in there about the refuge, all right? Healthy children, clean air and water, renewables, but you've got that group of people that are going to go, what if it's a big hoax and we create a better world for nothing? And you're going to face those people. You will face them. Having said that, that's it for me, and we're going to start taking some questions. And remember, it's being taped, and so we hope that you're going to give us insight. That stuff will be captured, and then we'll have it for posterity.
Are we allowed to make comments as well without asking questions? Okay. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Barry Stiglitz. I'm the project leader for the Hawaiian and Pacific Islands National Wildlife Refuge Complex. I want to start by saying aloha, talofa, tiro, and hafade. Those are all languages that are spoken in units of the National Wildlife Refuge System in the Pacific. I want to put some additional context onto the severity of the sea level rise and neighbors issue. I'm going to disagree with my colleague, Mr. Hinds. In the Pacific, we have 215 million acres of marine habitats. Only 54 million, though, are in the National Wildlife Refuge System. So it's only a third of the refuge system. And to try and put a good spin on this, when you're given lemons, you make lemonade. So let's use the same saying that's used at weddings. We're not losing terrestrial habitat so much as we are gaining marine habitat. That's my positive spin on some of this, because that's a large part of what we do. And just to put another community element on it, while the Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas is not in danger of going underwater, and the island of Guam is not in danger of going underwater, there are a number of island communities in the Pacific that are being evacuated. Those people have no doubt in their minds that sea level rise is a very real thing. So again, this is mostly commentary to put some additional context on the other side of the refuge system from where we are. But the people in the Carterets, we should ask them what they think about sea level rise, because they're leaving, and Tuvalu and places like that. So my question that I would like to hear what you all think, I reacted to, I think Noah said, getting through the bottleneck. I've had discussions within Region 1 about whether it's worth our investment to maintain infrastructure on remote islands that may be going underwater in 50 or 100 years. And my reaction has been that until there's a place for the wildlife that utilizes those refuges to go, climate change, migration corridors, or something else, it seems like a worthwhile investment. But I'm worried about this sort of attitude of, well, that refuge is going to be underwater in 100 years, so we're not going to put any more money into it. I'm worried about the time between here and there. So my question for the panel is, have you been aware of any other discussions about that? And how is anybody else addressing it or thinking about it? And I will end it there and apologize for taking such a long time. Thank you.
That's a great question, Barry. You know, you can almost ask the same question about Alligator River. So I think there is utility in, one, buying time in certain places for certain purposes, but I think you have to know what your goal is and how you're going to try to get there. Excuse me. So in terms of positive things, in the last year, 6 months, I've actually seen a couple of stories that come across my desk, excuse me, of species actually responding to climate change in adaptive ways. I've heard a story of some butterfly species that have gotten lighter in color because it's getting warmer out, and they're ectothermic, so they don't want to absorb as much sun. There's a species of owl in Norway that in the winter it's usually white, but because the snow's melting earlier, they're adapting and becoming more brownish or losing their color faster. There's some plant species that are doing similar things. So these stories to me give me hope that species, not all of them, some species can actually cope with the change. So buying time allows that natural adaptive mechanisms to work. At the same time, the pace of climate change, even if we buy time, is not going to allow a lot of species to do that. So we'll have to do, A, we'll have to let places and species go, and two, if we want to keep certain places or species, we're going to have to do stuff. We have to manage. I think I'll end there.
I've heard the question from within the service, which kind of disappoints me, because one, there's no certitude about what I said. You know, you aren't certain that the sea is going to continue to rise, but I am certain that the migratory birds that come every fall are going to arrive again looking for the habitat that we manage, and therefore I'm going to manage it to the best of my ability for their return each fall. And for every other species that utilizes that landscape, I'm going to try and sustain it for as long as I can, because that's the patch of ground I was given stewardship of. That's what I'm going to take care of. And my partners agree. That's what we ought to be doing in the near term. It does disappoint sometimes to hear people say, well, just walk away if you don't think it's going to be there in 100 years. Well, look, I know that with the models that I've been presented from good science, that 80% of Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge could be gone in 150 years. But I want to manage that refuge in my short tenure, and I want future managers to the maximum benefit of wildlife while it's there. So I don't think it's an issue we ever should address in a way that we either turn the switch on or off on a refuge. I mean, there's just a continuum. I mean, anybody that asks that question within the service needs to, revisit Ecology 101 and some basic conservation biology, because there is just no simple turn on or off switch unless you have a catastrophic, event that cleans the slate.
And Barry, if I could, my history is, as I started off as a maintenance man. For 8 years I was a maintenance worker. And I look at the investment in the infrastructure. Now, they've covered the wildlife. Let me just talk a little bit about the infrastructure. Building roads, building buildings, building water control structures, dikes, dams, whatever we do. I'm looking at 50 years out right now, because if I do anything, and we're actually discussing, not all inundation by the sea is bad. When we have these strong storms, I'm telling you, the habitat that comes out after that storm is phenomenal for piping plovers, shorebirds. We get thousands of birds nesting on our refuge beaches. And quite frankly, that parking lot and that recreational beach has taken up some of the best wildlife habitat I've got. And I'm mitigating for that in an impoundment, where I have to drain that impoundment down and provide shorebird nesting habitat there. So what we just did, and how many of you out there have heard structured decision-making? Good, good, you know what I'm talking about. We went through a major structured decision-making project just recently where we looked at, I said, the refuge is wide open. Find me the best place for humans, but wildlife doesn't care. I can't quite put that into words because every time it does, it comes out wrong. But the beach that's least utilized by wildlife, but still gives us a beach for human habitation. And so my biologists got a chance to use 20, 30 years worth of data that's just been sitting there. We've been collecting, never use it for anything. They got a chance to use it. And when they did, they came up and they said, wow, we've got the place for that beach. And so we're actually through the CCP process looking at migrating the beach north to an area that's more stable. We can provide parking well away from the beach and create or develop infrastructure for a 50-year time frame. I'm looking at a road, 50 years. I'm looking at a building, 50 years. I'm looking at parking lots, 50 years. If I can't at least get that amount out of it, I don't think it's responsible or sustainable for us to be putting taxpayers' money into that. So that's where I'm at right now, Barry. I'm just looking long-term, what's the biggest bang for the buck? And that's where I'm at right now.
We should also mention that we're doing SDM, I'm in back way. We're doing SDM for a lot of our coastal impoundments in Region 5 to determine what Barry was asking, how long we should throw money into the maintenance of those mostly waterfowl impoundments that we have up and down the Atlantic coast. So we're trying to apply SDM to that too, as far as infrastructure for the voice oil management units that we're doing.
Thank you, and I wish we would add the speaker back there for that. I see Graham Taylor sitting in the audience here, and he also is part of that overall SDM impoundment study, and thank you for bringing that up, Jared. Denny.
Is it possible to put that pony roundup slide back on the screen for a moment of comparison?
If my colleagues can find it, yes, or
And your pointer,
no, okay.
if I may?
The top one, Denny, right there. For those of you who don't know, this is Denny Holland, the former refuge manager at Chincoteague. Now, it's Chincoteague, not Chincoteague, Chincoteague National Wildlife Refuge.
Is that the slide you wanted?
That was the one. Yeah. All right. Let's see. I came to be the manager of Chincoteague in September of 1980. There was a bathhouse about here that was built in 1962 when the beach was out to here. One of the markers that Lou showed you was a Coast and Geodetic Survey marker following the Ash Wednesday storm of 1962, which first came uncovered with a northeaster when I was there in 1981. It disappeared within 6 months' time because the erosion in this area was so great. We put in a bike path from the headquarters over here, brought it around, and paralleled the beach well behind the dunes. It's gone now, isn't it, Lou?
Yes. It's all
Yeah, all right. We had an overwash that occurred up here. There was a parking lot with 60 vehicle slots available to it. There's, up here is an old Coast Guard station right there. And you don't know the flack that I caught because the parking lot's washed out and they wanted to repave the road. Well, This was under the jurisdiction of management, I should say, by the Park Service. Political influence quickly overcame my resistance, especially when the assistant secretary says, okay, we'll fix it. $100,000 was spent to put in an unpaved road because I said, you know, no pavement. Please, for God's sakes, stay away from that because it'll end up over here in the bay shortly anyway. 6 weeks later, that new road was gone. They went back to the assistant secretary, Ray Arnett, and says, we got to have that road replaced. He said, I did it one time. You're not getting it anymore. Live with it the way it is. Learn to live with it. So the 961 parking slots had to be recounted, and that became a real problem. But the main issue is shoreline is moving extremely fast, maybe not too high, but the lateral effect is enormous. Fortunately, this strip has built the way I predicted it would. For God's sakes, it's got to roll over. It has to move to the west. When it rolls over, it builds. The argument they were making was that it will cut off. There'll be the hook will be cut off. Nope, won't happen. If it does, it won't last long. Point being, that is a fabulous place, but it is dynamic. It's going to change every day, and it has, and it will continue. And I hope that one of these days I'll be able to get back over there and see it. Thanks, Lou.
Thank you, Denny. There was a gentleman back there that had a question. Thank you, Denny.
Thanks. Really inspiring work that you guys are doing, and I'm really glad to hear about it. But a couple of thoughts. Climate change seems it's a systemic problem. I mean, it's by definition, it's a global problem. It's the mother of all systemic problems. And I'm troubled because there doesn't seem to be a systemic response on the part of the service. That we've got great programs. I mean, the program at Alligator River, the program that you guys are doing, you are responding very creatively, very proactively to your situation, which is what you can do. But it seems to me, especially in the context of a vision, which we're talking about at this conference, and in the light of the undeniable changes that so many refuge managers are seeing, we would want to be putting in place a more systemic response than I'm aware of, at least. And it also strikes me that the fabulous work that is happening at Alligator River, as you said, you're doing it with $10,000 worth of your money. The $1 million to do the work that's getting done, which is great, is not coming from the service. And I mean, it's a great triumph of creative management, but it's, to me, also a failure of our ability to direct our resources to these very critical problems, which, you know, are so widespread that we should be the ones. I mean, obviously, if we get resources elsewhere, we take advantage of them, but we should also be allocating those resources to find these experimental solutions that you're finding or you're trying to find to these challenges. So I guess in the context of this vision conference, I am disappointed that we're not seeing a more systemic response to look across our system at all those refuges that you mentioned, Lou, that have these coastal resources, and try to prioritize what to do. And that doesn't mean turning our back completely on any of the refuges and walking away, but it does perhaps mean saying, well, this refuge is where we got to put our resources first. This refuge seems less critical. This refuge is just going to be underwater, and we're going to have to ease it into that transition rather than fight it, whatever it takes. But you can't make those decisions without, I think, you can't intelligently make those decisions without a system-wide response. So I mean, I guess it's just a long editorial on my part, but it comes from what you guys have said, and I hope that in the next few years we'll get to that point.
That was actually the comment that I was looking for, and thank you for saying it so eloquently. I have been disappointed. You got to understand, I think we shouldn't beat ourselves up too much. How many years are we into the Obama administration? 3 years? It's only been 3 years we've been allowed to talk about climate change and sea level rise. Well, let's not beat ourselves up here. All right, but I'm hoping that this vision conference will do exactly that, give us a longer-term vision of where the Fish and Wildlife Service wants to take those coastal refuges and what we should be doing. Right now, on my own, I'm just going through the CCP process, and I'm quite openly, and with Marvin, if you were in here for the last panel discussion, Marvin brought up the fact that I'm openly looking to migrate the refuge up higher onto the mainland. If I'm going to meet my migratory bird purposes of the refuge for which Chincoteague was established, I can't do it there. In 100 years, I won't be able to do it on Aztec Island. It'll be great migratory shorebird habitat, but as far as waterfowl, I'm not going to be able to do it there. So, good point.
I'd like to add something to that. What Lou said is, I think the systematic solution that we can give is the ability to talk about it. Like Lou said, we haven't been able to talk about it until this administration. I don't know that there's a systematic solution for all refuges, because like Barry said, I mean, his problems are a lot different than Chincoteague's. Back Bays are a lot different than Chincoteague's or Alligator River. In our case, we look at our slams, and it's a wildlife biologist's dream, because our emergent marsh turns into open water, and our forested wetlands or our farm fields turn into emergent marsh. I mean, the biggest impact is going to be to the community around Back Bay, not so much from what I've seen in the SLAM analysis to the wildlife. We're different than Alligator River. We're different than Chincoteague. So I don't know that there is a systematic solution except the fact that we're being allowed to talk about it, we're being allowed to coordinate with our communities, with the NGOs, and I think, like in a lot of things in refuge management, the solutions are individual to each refuge, because I think the problems are going to manifest themselves differently. Just my opinion.
I just wanted to comment on the comment. Completely agree. Just for context, though, if you look over the last year and a half, you had your director tragically pass away, and that I mean, up until that point, Fish and Wildlife Service was the lead agency, I think, in the entire federal government on adaptation, without a doubt. That stalled a lot of things. In fact, up until a week ago, you haven't been able to move any kind of major policy, anything, as an agency without a director. What are the chief obstacles to Dan Ash's confirmation hearings? Inhofe kept asking him about climate change. Obviously, some other endangered species issues came up too. But so, ever since 2010 election, you would think, I live in the Beltway, inside the Beltway actually, you would think the climate change doesn't exist anymore. No one talks about it anymore. So and then just a few weeks ago, as the appropriations bill started hitting the House floor, we've seen amendments on appropriations bills blocking any spending from the Department of Homeland Security on adaptation, from the Department of Agriculture on adaptation. The Interior bills are going through right now. There's some negative climate change language there, but once it hits the floor, we expect an amendment that blocks all the entire interior department from doing anything on adaptation. So that's the political context that we live in. So in terms of, I completely agree. I've been pushing for more aggressive national policy guidance and boldness on behalf of the service administration. But just be aware that the bolder it gets, the more stuff's going to, politically, we have to be politically smart about it. I'm not sure how to thread that needle at this point, but I just want to provide that kind of context.
When we started 7 years ago, there wasn't an environment in which to have a dialogue, but with partners. We just, the Nature Conservancy helped create the Alligator River Refuge, so they had an interest, and we just started talking, and then I said, look, yeah, my shoreline is eroding. I've lost 10,000 acres of forest since 1984. Salt water's breaking down my soils. I'm seeing ditches wide. All these things are happening, and as refuge managers, if you don't hold on to the one trait, and that's have a bias toward action, you're going to lose. So, I was going to take action with or without help from the agency, and I had a friend, and they had the magic ability to go find money, and they found it from the corporate sector. And we had Duke Energy executives out a month ago, and they were so refreshed by seeing the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Nature Conservancy stand there and tell them about this story that they were spending money on, and they could see the structure. And they said, we just came from a meeting with stockholders, and they just chewed us up and down. And now we're seeing you all honestly and enthusiastically liking each other and working together and getting something done on the ground. Even they were enthusiastic, and these are the energy executives. So we've got a story as an agency working with our partners that resonates with everybody, because it's one, you're taking action. You're not just pondering and rubbing your chin or dutifully writing down the doom and gloom that's happening. You're doing something.